Joining us now is Michael OHanlin. He is Director of Foreign Policy Research at the Brookings Institution. To paraphrase Winston Churchill, it's better to meet jaw to jaw than meet in war. Ideally, if you're talking, you're not fighting, but Zelensky and Putin are not in the same room. How much could we actually expect to accomplish from Trump and Putin, if anything?
Greetings. Well, the worst case outcome would be if somehow President Trump were wooed by Vladimir Putin into thinking and believing that the land that Putin wants is really rightfully Russia's anyway, based on some historical fairy tale that Putin probably believes, but is based on a very selective reading of history. And Trump decides to push for that and essentially, strong arm Ukraine into that kind of approach. But I don't think President Trump's going to make that mistake. I think he's been around this issue now a while. I think most of his movement in 2025 has been in the correct direction of understanding who caused the war and who is the obstacle to peace. And that's Putin in both cases, as we know. And so I'd be very disappointed and surprised if Trump wound up so gullible as to just fully adopt the Putin line. I think where Trump may be willing to do things that, let's say, a lot of the foreign policy community would not like would be to rule out NATO membership for Ukraine forever. I could live with alternative concepts besides NATO. But of course, the foreign policy communities in the United States and Western Europe have espoused this idea for a long time. Putin hates it. That's the kind of place where you might see Trump do some deals that a lot of people would complain about, but I think might be useful to jumpstart a subsequent negotiation. Just one last point. It was very good that Trump said today that he's not going to make the deal because he knows it's not his job. That's very encouraging. Again, all he can do is pressure the parties. He knows they have to get together and make the decision.
Yeah, and Europe also will, they can offer their recommendations. This is what we'd like to see happen. But ultimately, Ukraine, a sovereign nation, a proud nation, they're going to ultimately do what they want. And they will fight as long as they have to get what they want. No one can blame them for that. So is this meeting, Michael, even worth it if Volodymyr Zelensky is A, not invited, or B, invited but does not come?
Yeah, it's still worth it. But I think, President Trump's going to have to go in with a clear sense of his willingness to put more pressure on Russia, the way he actually already has with the additional tariffs on India for buying Russian oil. I don't necessarily agree with that particular approach, but the general concept of putting more pressure on Russia if they continue to obstruct peace and continue to fight is absolutely correct. So that sort of thing is important. President Zelensky's got to be careful here, however, because if he thinks that any kind of land swap is fundamentally unacceptable, then I think he could wind up the odd man out in this conversation. And at that point, he might lose President Trump, and we could be back to where we were at the start of the year. Morally speaking, of course, there's no reason for Russia to be allowed to steal any of the land from Ukraine that it's taken since 2014. However, practically speaking, we're going to have to find some pragmatic outcomes here that we don't necessarily love. And I think that could include land swaps. So Zelensky should be flexible on that point, at least in theory for now.
And I referenced Winston Churchill, Michael, or at least bastardized it at the top, because the idea is simply being, if you're talking, you're hopefully not fighting. A lot of people, as you know, are going to find any meeting with Vladimir Putin unseemly. I get it. He's a terrible guy. He's a dangerous man, and his country is backed against the wall. But at least if they are talking, should we take some positives from that? Or should Vladimir Putin be cast off like a Kim Jong-il, like the Kim Il-sung, like the dictator he is?
I don't mind the talking. But of course, Churchill was not talking to Hitler during World War II.
100%.
There got to be a point, right? And we're at a point. I'm not saying Putin's quite as bad as Hitler, but I think Putin's behavior is atrocious and abominable. And if he uses the idea of negotiations to just keep persuading Donald Trump to postpone additional sanctions, that would be regrettable. That could be a way in which talks actually are a net negative. So I'm hopeful that Trump will stand his ground and be willing to keep applying more pressure if he doesn't see some room for compromise from Putin.